Spring came early to the Duke's estate, yet warmth did not soften its rules. Steam rose from copper vats, knives rang against boards, and gossip moved like heat between bodies pressed into labor. Julia stood at the far table where the light thinned, sleeves rolled, hair bound, hands red from scalding water. At 22, she had learned the discipline of invisibility, how to keep her eyes lowered while her thoughts wandered. The house praised her soups and censured her silences. She was known for flavor, not for spirit. In that narrow distance between breath and duty, her truest self waited. On that morning, when the other servants drifted toward breakfast duties, Julia lingered in the scullery, alone with echo and steam. The rhythm of work followed her pulse, and without deciding to, she let her body answer it. A turn between the sinks, a lift of the arms to the rafters slick with vapor, a barefoot glide across cold stone. It was not joy she danced for, but memory for the girl she had been before survival taught restraint. The world briefly widened around her. Even the spoon seemed to pause, listening to something untrained yet fiercely alive. It was a defiance so small it barely deserved the name of rebellion. He entered without sound, as men of authority often do, presence announced only after it already fills the room. The Duke was 24 and already shaped by command. His youth pressed flat beneath discipline learned too early. He had come seeking order, not revelation, yet what met his eyes was a servant turning through vapor as if the air itself yielded to her will. For a breath he did not speak, and in that suspended instant, something startled and uncertain stirred beneath the cool architecture of his composure. Then authority returned, swift and merciless, as armor does when a heart grows vulnerable. "You are here to cook, not to dance." His voice carried across stone and steel, precise and devastatingly calm. The words struck not as anger, but as dismissal, and their cruelty lay exactly there. Julia froze mid-turn, caught between the memory of freedom and the certainty of consequence. Another servant had entered behind him, then another, and the moment widened into spectacle. She curtsied, clumsy in haste, cheeks burning, eyes fixed on the floor. No apology came, only silence. The Duke waited as if measuring her obedience, then turned away, the matter settled in his mind as efficiently as a ledger closed. Laughter did not dare sound aloud, yet it lived in glances and in the tightening at the corners of mouths. By noon the scene had been shaped into a story, and by evening into scandalous embroidery. Some said she had danced for him, others that she had attempted to entice him, still others that he had rescued her from disgrace with stern mercy. Julia moved through the rest of the day like a ghost among breathing bodies. Every look and accusation she could neither answer nor escape. Shame clung to her skin as closely as steam, and she scrubbed until her hands no longer felt her own. The Duke dined alone that night, a habit born not of solitude's comfort, but of habit's tyranny. The silence of the long table offered its usual obedience, yet his mind refused its participation. Unbidden, the image returned, a servant girl in motion, unguarded, fearless for the span of a single breath. He told himself it had been insolence, that disorder invites decay, that he had acted correctly. Still, as he lifted his fork, he noticed the faint tremor in his own hand. It unsettled him more than he would ever confess to name that trembling curiosity. Below stairs, Julia lay sleepless on her narrow bed as whispers seeped through walls as thin as mercy. She had been foolish, she knew that much, foolish to let motion betray the hidden shape of her longing. In the dark she pressed her palms together, as if in prayer, though no petition formed upon her lips. She had come to this estate to survive, not to be seen. To be noticed by power was its own dangerous kind of exposure, and she felt the weight of it now, like a shadow cast long and cold over her small remaining hopes. Morning arrived with orders delivered as impersonally as weather. Julia was to prepare a private supper that evening, alone, for the Duke. The words were not explanation, but command, and they struck her with a fear sharper than the humiliation of the day before. Some noticed and pitied. Others envied. None could tell her whether this summons meant punishment, test, or something more treacherously uncertain. She folded the message into her apron and went back to her work, unaware that the quiet architecture of her life had already begun to fracture under the pressure of a single, unseen gaze. Julia entered the private kitchen at dusk with measured steps, the summons folded like a verdict against her ribs. The room was smaller than the grand halls above, yet heavier with meaning, all polished brass and waiting shadows. She laid out herbs with ritual care, each leaf placed as if order itself might shield her. When the Duke arrived, his presence altered the air without sound, and she felt it before she saw him. He spoke no greeting, only inclined his head slightly, as one acknowledges a function rather than a person. The silence settled between them with deliberate weight. He took his seat at the narrow table and at last regarded her directly, not as spectacle, but as problem unresolved. She served the first course with steady hands, though her pulse was loud enough to shame her. He tasted, paused, then continued eating without comment. The approval was subtle, and somehow more unsettling than rebuke. As she retreated, a small parcel slid across the table by his fingers, stopping before it reached the edge. He did not look at her when he said, in a tone almost indifferent, that it was surplus from his stores. Silently, she received it. In her attic room, she unwrapped the parcel by candlelight and found a ribbon of pale blue silk, finer than anything she had ever touched. The gift frightened her more than it pleased her, for kindness from above had sharp edges. The next days answered her fear. Glances chased her through corridors, and questions formed without voices. Another token followed, this time a rare spice left at her station as if by accident. The staff no longer pretended ignorance. They watched her as one watches a wick already aflame, waiting for either miracle or smoke. Even her breath felt borrowed. The Duke observed the spreading unease with a restraint that was not indifference but calculation. He noted how she shrank from common spaces, how her answers shortened, how the quiet pride in her carriage bent inward. When he corrected a scullery boy for muttering at her expense, the room stilled in disbelief. Authority had leaned, unmistakably, in her direction. The protection cost him nothing in rank and everything in rumor. That evening she met his gaze across the serving table for the first time, without lowering her eyes, and both were unsettled by the steadiness. Something unspoken pressed against them. Isolation tightened around Julia with every dawn. Invitations to share bread fell away, replaced by cautious distance. She moved through the kitchens as if through shallow water, effortful and alone. Shame was no longer loud. It had become intimate, a companion whispering doubt at every pause. Yet beneath it lived an unfamiliar stirring of defiance, quiet and stubborn. She had done no wrong except be seen. The Duke felt that assertion in her posture, even when she tried to erase it. Power had named her once, and the name, whether curse or protection, now followed her shadow through narrow corridors. The third gift arrived without disguise, set deliberately beside her knife. A small book of dances, its pages faintly scented with lavender. The audacity of it left her breathless with mingled fear and recognition. He had not merely seen her movement. He had answered it. Julia closed the book as if it might speak aloud and betray them both. By nightfall the servants knew. Glances sharpened into judgment, and pity hardened into anticipation. They said the Duke's interest would scorch her and leave only a vacancy behind. Another warning folded into routine. She began to believe them with trembling certainty. The Duke received reports of her distress as one receives weather, without seeking yet unable to ignore. He had not intended cruelty, nor rescue. Intention had deserted him entirely. In her bowed head, he recognized something that mirrored his own early training, the same learned shrinking before command. The recognition disturbed him deeply. One afternoon, he summoned her to the corridor outside the kitchens under the pretense of provisions. They stood at a careful distance, their words narrowed by formality. When he told her she was not dismissed from favor, Relief flashed in her eyes before discipline reclaimed them both. That fragile moment did not undo the world's appetite for ruin. By evening, Julia overheard her name shaped with cruel leisure, wagered upon as if her future were small coin. She realized then that protection, once visible, becomes another form of danger. That night, she packed her few belongings with deliberate calm, each folded piece a farewell to hope she scarcely dared to name. At dawn, she would ask to be released from service, not in accusation, but in surrender. Above her unknowing resolve, the Duke prepared for a reckoning he did not yet understand was already at hand waiting. Julia approached the garden at dusk with resignation steadied into courage, her request for dismissal folded neatly within her voice. The lilacs were heavy with scent, purple shadows pooling beneath them like held breath. The Duke waited near the iron gate, posture formal yet restless. When she spoke, her words were precise, almost rehearsed, asking only to be released from service without consequence. She neither accused nor pleaded. The restraint unsettled him more than if she had wept, for it declared what he had not anticipated. He replied that departure was unnecessary, that gossip was a fragile currency unworthy of her fear, yet the formality of his tone betrayed uncertainty beneath the assurance. She answered that protection visible to all was another kind of exposure, more perilous than neglect. Their eyes met without permission, measuring distance that rank insisted must remain. In that quiet standoff, the truth hovered near enough to wound, yet neither named it. The garden listened with still leaves and tightening twilight. He wished to speak beyond duty, and the wishing startled him with its force. He told her of solitary meals and titles that echoed louder than voices, of a youth shaped into command before it learned tenderness. Julia listened as one listens to rain after drought, drawing meaning from sound as much as from sense. When she answered, she spoke of kitchens and careful silence, of learning that hope must be portioned like bread. Their confessions were modest, yet their modesty made them dangerous. The space between them narrowed without touch, compressed by what had been disclosed. At the gate her hand lifted as if to steady herself, and as moved in reflex before discipline arrested him. The near meeting lingered like heat in metal pulled too soon from flame. He promised her protection again, more firmly now, though still without the language of affection. She accepted not as surrender, but as truce, knowing truce is only credible when war waits nearby. The following morning delivered the world's answer with merciless efficiency. A noble woman arrived in shining carriage and whispered purpose, her presence arranged with the inevitability of weather-long forecast. The Duke met her beneath open sky, while below stairs Julia received reassignment to the laundry without explanation. The change was announced as correction rather than punishment, yet every tone made clear its intent. She bowed to the order with a calm learned through years of endurance. Steam replaced flame as her new horizon, and water erased the scent of herbs from her hands. The work punished the body more frankly than the kitchen, and in its bluntness she found a strange relief. Yet the silence around her thickened with meaning. Even the book of dances had vanished from her station as if proof itself had been recalled. The Duke, learning of the reassignment, understood too late that protection delayed is often indistinguishable from abandonment. By evening, the rumor had ripened into certainty that she had aspired beyond her station and been quietly corrected. Julia folded shirts beneath low rafters while listening to the verdict of voices that did not trouble to soften themselves. Each word pressed upon her like wet linen, heavy with borrowed judgment. When at last her strength failed her, she sank against the wall and let breath shudder from her chest in a single betrayed sob. In his study above, the Duke stood at the window long after the carriage had departed, confronted by the symmetry of loss on two different tiers of his world. He had intended to shield her with discretion and discovered instead the violence of delay. For the first time, the discipline that had always governed him felt like cowardice dressed as caution. Below, unseen, Julia rose from the floor with resolve tightened by pain, unaware that his hesitation had already joined their fates. She did not seek him again, deciding that dignity must sometimes walk away without witness. Yet every corridor carried the memory of that gate. Every pause and labor echoed with what had nearly been spoken. He summoned and dismissed preparations for society dinners with mechanical precision, while her absence from the kitchens unsettled him like a missing step upon a familiar stair. Both moved forward under the guise of endurance, each imagining solitude as safety. Still, endurance without truth is only delay in heavier clothing. The evening settled with deceptive calm upon the estate, and within that calm, two decisions waited, unannounced and irreversible, pressing toward collision. Tomorrow would demand speech where silence had ruled, and courage where caution had been sovereign. For now there was only the waiting, taut as wire between tower and laundry wall, trembling with what might break or bind. Neither of them slept, and neither yet understood that sleep itself had fled their world tonight entirely. The night of the spring assembly arrived wrapped in lantern light and trembling anticipation, and Julia returned to the great house only as a servant summoned for duty, her presence permitted, but her hope forbidden, her eyes lowered yet drawn toward the distant music drifting through open doors. The scent of flowers and polish and warm bodies pressed upon her senses as memories of the garden gate fluttered painfully awake within her chest. Above the crowd the Duke moved with exquisite restraint among nobles who spoke of alliances as calmly as harvest yields, his answers measured, his attention divided between expectation and the quiet pull of one figure moving always at the edges of his vision. When a noblewoman's hand rested possessively upon his arm, he felt not flattered but narrowed, as if the future were closing like a velvet-lined cage around his breath. Julia served beneath chandeliers that scattered light like judgment, her steps precise, her face composed into obedience, yet each note of the orchestra pierced her with remembered movement and the echo of forbidden freedom. She told herself she had already relinquished what might have been, that survival demanded forgetting. Yet the body does not always accept the arguments of fear so easily or so completely. The moment arrived without deliberate invitation, born from a swell of violins and the aching, rising insistence of rhythm that claimed her despite resolve, and from behind a marble column she allowed herself one single truth of motion. It was not confident now, but wounded and honest, shaped by longing rather than joy, and every step confessed what her lips would not dare name. The Duke saw her then as if the room itself had parted for revelation, and the sight struck him with a force no discipline could mute, for in that restrained yet desperate movement lived the answer to every silence he had endured. The noblewoman spoke at his side, yet her words fell soundlessly into distance, as if the air had chosen only one meaning to carry. He crossed the ballroom floor not with haste, but with unmistakable purpose, the music faltering as attention followed his path, and when he spoke it was not loudly, yet it arrested the room as completely as command ever had. He named no confession, only declared that he would no longer accept a future forged without truth and the simplicity of it unmade years of careful pretense. Julia stood frozen between terror and wonder as his gaze found her openly at last, stripped of shadow and subterfuge, and in that gaze lay neither ownership nor rescue but recognition. When he offered his hand, the crowd seemed to inhale as one body, but she weighed dignity before daring and placed her fingers within his only after her spine had straightened in quiet defiance. The cost announced itself swiftly in turned shoulders and severed invitations, in fortunes politely withdrawn and alliances cooled into elegant distance. Yet he met each loss with the calm of a man who has already surrendered what once terrified him. Julia left service not in exile, but in chosen uncertainty, carrying no wealth beyond the stubborn proof that she had been seen and believed. Their courtship unfolded without spectacle, measured in letters and walks beneath unguarded skies, in conversations where fear and hope learned at last to share the same breath without canceling one another. He learned the gentleness of waiting, she the courage of expectation, and between them grew a language unruled by kitchen bells or drawing room clocks. The morning they were married returned the earth to the promise of first spring, modest in witness yet rich in meaning. And when Julia moved across the grass toward him, there was no shadow left upon her steps. In the quiet that followed their vows, she danced once more without hiding, and he watched not as master nor savior, but as the man who had finally chosen to feel.